Hello, and welcome to State of the State. I'm your host, Jody Harris from the Maine Center for Economic Policy, and today we're going to be talking about Governor LePage's proposed state budget. Earlier this month, the governor submitted some spending cuts for the two-year budget that starts July 1st of this year. One of the things the governor's proposed to do is to eliminate a program that helps lower municipal budgets called municipal revenue sharing. And we have two guests here today who know a lot about that subject. Welcome. I'm delighted to introduce to you Bill Briggio, who's a city manager here in Augusta. And Bill, I think you've been on a number of these shows, so you're probably a familiar face to our listeners today, our watchers.
Yeah,
today.
unfortunately. Yeah.
So thank you for being here. And also with us today is Garrett Martin, my colleague at the Maine Center for Economic Policy. He's the executive director there. And Garrett, you've done some analysis on these budget proposals, so I'm hoping you'll share your findings with us today.
Sure, yeah.
So why don't we start with you? What I hope, maybe just talk a little bit about the budget process, where we are, and what's going to happen over the coming months.
Great, love to. Thanks, Jody. Well, for starters, I think what folks need to appreciate is how we got here.
Oh, that's good.
And an important point to make there is that, you know, the challenge we face right now is a result of a tremendous drop in revenues that occurred as a result of the recession. We're down, we calculate at the Maine Center for Economic Policy based on sort of historic trends. We're about $305 million below where we would be a year in terms of money coming into the state that could be used to pay for things like education.
In a normal year without a recession.
In a normal year, you know, education, healthcare, public safety, public services, those kinds of things. So we came into this crisis or this budget year already challenged as a result of the recession. On top of that, the last legislature, the 125th legislature, passed a number of tax cuts. The signature part of that was an income tax cut that effectively means that we have $433 million less in money coming into the state as a result of those tax cuts than we did before. So when folks talk about our budget challenges here in Maine, many people like to point out the fact that we have a budget gap of about $881 million. Well, it turns out over the next 2 years, it turns out of that $881 million, $600 million is roughly attributed to the drops in recession, and then another $400 million, so more than the amount of the budget gap, is attributed to the income tax cuts. So that just kind of level sets and says, we've got a challenge here, and as much as we'd like to think we could cut spending to resolve that gap, the reality is many towns and even the state have already made significant cuts in areas like education, healthcare, those kinds of things. So
because the state's been cutting budgets for 6 years now already.
That's right. When the recession hit, everybody got hit hard by that. You know, the money stopped coming in, and so folks had to pare down. But in terms of the process, you're right. The governor proposes his budget, and ultimately the legislature, and that's the saving grace here, the legislature really gets to sort of kick the tires on it and say, well, what is this going to mean for Maine people, and what's it going to mean for Maine towns, and what's it going to mean for our ability to make the kinds of investments we need to make to get our economy back up and going in the way we want it to.
The governor proposes and the legislature disposes is
that's right.
What
we
hear a lot.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's ultimately the legislature's decision.
Right. So over the next couple of months, there's going to be a lot of tough conversations here in Augusta that we hope folks at home will pay attention to, because I think at the end of the day, there are a lot of pocketbook issues at play. At the Maine Center, we've calculated that, you know, ultimately this budget reflects or represents a tremendous shift to towns and to property taxpayers. And while there were income tax cuts that were passed in the last legislative session, the property tax increases that we project would occur as a result of this budget likely would dwarf the benefits of those income tax cuts for over 80% of Maine households.
And that was last year's cut. So on top of that, we are also going to be talking about this year's proposed cut. So
that's right.
The shift to property taxpayers is already happening, and then it's going to get worse.
Right.
Is what I'm hearing.
I'm smiling, but I'm not really smiling inside. Because as you two both appreciate, this is a really difficult conversation for municipal officials to have, whether they're elected or appointed like I am. You know, a long, long time ago, in a land far, far away, I was a young rookie city manager in my early 30s in Calais, Maine. And in those days, I was great friends with a much younger rookie town manager from East Millinocket, Maine, one Jody Harris. And,
We're going way back now.
and we're talking 30 years ago now, where Jody and I formed a friendship bond back then that's been real strong ever since. And Garrett, I got to say, I was delighted to learn last year that she had come aboard.
Oh, we're thrilled
with
to
the
have
Maine
her.
Center,
Yeah.
and
Very kind, thank you.
You're not only thrilled, but you're very fortunate
Yes,
to have
that
such
too.
talent on your team. So, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and frankly, these last few years have been the most difficult in that whole 35-year municipal career. And frankly, if things go forward as the governor has proposed, they're going to be, I think, the most difficult of the more difficult period of time. It's tough. First of all, you know, I should say from the outset that I don't dispute the governor's belief and the belief of those legislators who feel that we have to make every effort possible to contain our taxes in Maine, whether it's the income tax or the sales tax or the property tax. That Maine is a relatively high tax state, at least on proportion of income.
Right.
You know that our income is lower than many states,
Right.
so that our overall tax burden is not necessarily all that high, but when you apply it to what our folks earn as a percentage of income,
Right.
it is high.
And
So
that's why we'd like to see more strategic ways to boost income.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
And so, you know, there's really no disputing the idea that we have to work very hard at the state level and at the local level to contain costs. And
Right.
and you know, watching our legislature in the last legislature, the 2 years just passed, they did work really hard. Now, I took issue with them when they passed the income and estate tax
Right.
cuts because they weren't funded.
Right.
And they left until this legislature the task of funding them. And as we've seen in the governor's recently released budget, it's extraordinary, breathtaking, how those cuts have basically just been sloughed off
Right.
to local governments. And what's particularly troubling is at least some people that you listen to seem to suggest that local governments have a pattern or a history of being drunken sailors when it comes to spending. And I just don't think that's the case, frankly.
Just go to a town meeting and you find out pretty quickly.
Go to town meeting or go talk to any of the elected officials in any of the service center communities who, well, let's use Augusta as an example. The average increase in the tax rate in Augusta in the last 10 years, and I've been here for 15, in the last 10 years, through the hard work of the city councils, and the mayors, and city staff, has been less than 1% a year.
So you're not even keeping up with inflation. You know?
No, we're not
Increases
keeping up
in
with
fuel
inflation.
costs,
And
increases in
as you
insurance
referenced,
costs.
you know, the choking off of our revenues, our typical revenues, has been going on for a number of years. We get about 10%, we used to get about 10% of our revenues from state revenue sharing. That was 3 years ago for the city of Augusta about $2.6 million. And then the state took that away to balance the state budget 3 years ago under Governor Baldacci, and then 2 years ago and last year under Governor LePage. And Augusta lost $800,000
More.
in that grab from revenue sharing, and we had to tighten our belts without raising taxes, and we did it. How did we do that? Well, we laid off a bunch of people. We skinnied up a whole bunch of operations that were already lean and efficient. We asked our employees not to take raises, union and non-union employees. We required every employee to take 8 days off a year for several years in a row without pay. So I think that the employees did their share and the local government conscientiously met the challenge. Now, having gotten to that point, it's proposed that we lose a big chunk of additional money. And, you know, frankly, well, I've got a really talented, and if I ramble here, stop me.
I was going to ask, at some point, doesn't that impact services that the citizens
Well,
of this
that's the point I was going to make just now. And I'll show you each a very short accounting here that my really talented finance director and assistant city manager, Ralph St. Pierre, pulled together for me the other day so that I could share with the city council. The city budget for Augusta, the general, what we call the general government budget, which is not education and it's not special funds like the regional landfill or the airport or the civic center, but the general government, police and fire and public works and those types of things. That's about $24.5 million this year. Of that, 10% or $2.5 million is utilities.
Yep.
Water, sewer, lights, stuff you have to pay for.
Yep.
About 11% of it, $2.7 million, is insurances and obligations to retired employees that are you're contractually bound to. Another 3.5%, $840,000, is debt service, the principal and interest on bonds that you've already borrowed. And then almost 6%, or $1.4 million, is the county tax that by law each municipality has to pay. It's got no choice. 33% of our budget is public safety. The police department, the fire department, the ambulance service. And 14%, or $3.4 million, is public works. Plowing the streets, patching the streets, tending to the sidewalks, picking up the trash, core services. When you take the fixed costs of utilities and debt service and so forth and add that to public safety and public works, that's 76% of that $25 million budget. And that leaves about $6 million in all the other stuff, me and the assessor and the tax collector, economic development, recreation, library, Old Fort Western. If the governor's budget goes through with the complete elimination of revenue sharing, which for us is all that remains in that is about $1.6 million, we have to find $1.6 million in $5.8 million, or about 29% of everything that's spent. So, you know,
very small pot.
Do you want to close the library? Do you want not to have any recreational programs for senior citizens or children at risk? You want all our parks to shut down? Should we stop mowing the cemeteries?
Let me interrupt you right there, Bill. We're at about halfway point. We're going to take a short break. We've been talking with Bill Brigio, the city manager of Augusta, Garrett Martin, the executive director of the Maine Center for Economic Policy, talking about the impact of the governor's budget, proposed budget cuts. And when we come back, we'll talk about where we go from here with these. Thank you.
When you see curiosity, we see the beginnings of a new career. And when you see children playing well together, we see the roots of a workplace team. Maine's future depends on the success of every child. Babies and toddlers need opportunities to grow and learn away from toxic stress like poverty and domestic violence. When you see an engaged child, we see Maine's future. Supporting early childhood experiences today builds a productive workforce tomorrow.
Welcome back. You're listening to State of the State, and my guests today are Garrett Martin from the Maine Center for Economic Policy and Bill Brigio, the city manager of the city of Augusta. Before the break, we were talking about the governor's proposed budget cuts and the impact that that would have on the city of Augusta. I think maybe we could take a step back from that a bit, Garrett, and if you could maybe talk about what's in the governor's budget overall and sort of give us an overview.
Well, I think it makes perfect sense that we spend a lot of time talking about the revenue sharing cuts, because that represents the lion's share of the impact of this budget. You're talking about $200 million being cut out of the state budget that would go to support towns and municipalities around the state in delivering, core services.
Important services. Yeah.
But in addition to that, there's certainly a lot more that I think folks should be concerned with. If we stay in the line of kind of property taxes in municipalities, things like the homestead exemption program. So this is a program where an individual's first $10,000 of valuation they take off the top, and it reduces their taxes in some instances by an average of about $120 is what we see across the state. The circuit breaker program, which is a targeted property tax relief program specifically for low and moderate income families, that program is slated for elimination for anybody under the age of 65 or who is not a veteran. We know from our analysis that there are 60,000 households that make $40,000 or less a year who get an
that
average
are eligible for
that
this.
well, not that are eligible, who take advantage of it, because there's many more who are eligible. About half the people who are eligible actually utilize the program. So of the ones who utilize it, they're getting an average benefit of about $630. You in this program, their taxes are going to go up that amount the next day.
And can you talk, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you talk a little bit about why that's so much more important to lower your property taxes than it is to lower your income tax?
Sure, let me come back to that in a sec.
All right.
So there's a whole complement of cuts in order to close this budget gap that have to do with what towns receive from the state to offset expenditure on certain things and to support certain core services. There are cuts that affect people's bottom line, their taxes, both in the area of property tax but also in the area of income tax. There's a very interesting change in how our income tax rates go up over time, or brackets go up over time, that effectively will increase taxes, income taxes for individuals by an average of about $46 per person based on Maine Revenue Services calculation. And then in addition to that, and this is really where we should be concerned when we think about, here we are on the heels of one of the worst recession, on the heels of the worst recession since the Great Depression.
Right.
We've got families that have lost their jobs. Over 25,000 Maine people have lost their jobs since the recession began, who are struggling to make ends meet. And at the same time, we've got a disproportionate share of our population that's elderly. And our challenge as a state is, how do we, A, keep people from falling further behind, and at the same time position ourselves for future success? Well, the two ways you can do that are, one, to invest in a strong safety net, and this budget cuts out a lot of programs that way. Drugs for the elderly, a program that provides benefits to elderly individuals for prescription drugs, is an example there. General assistance, which is really a source of last resort for many families, and we know prevents homelessness throughout the state, has been slated for cut. And then the big one, in addition to revenue sharing, is K-12 education. In this state, Maine voters said, we want the state to pick up 55% of the cost of education. Well, we made progress toward that. But again, what happens? Recession hits, state says, whoop, we got to pull back. So the state has gradually decreased the amount of money it's contributing to education as a percentage of its overall cost. And that effectively puts greater pressure on municipalities as well. So there's a lot in this budget that really not only undermines the investments we should be making to position ourselves better as the recession comes off, but also shifts costs to towns, and then ultimately will result in higher taxes for individuals. The reason why the shift to property tax away from income tax is so important is that, who are the people who pay the most in income tax? Well, it's upper income individuals. That represents the greatest share of the taxes they pay between sales, property, and income tax. For lower income and middle income households, when you look at the pie of taxes that you pay, it's more about sales and property tax. So anything you do that, on one hand, decreases income tax, which is what we did in the last biennium 2 years ago, and results in an increase in property tax, ultimately that means you're completely juggling who pays what and how much, and ultimately means that lower income and middle income households are going to be worse off than upper income households, which is why we've said that the LePage tax cuts are ultimately a giveaway to the rich at the expense of everybody else.
Let me back that just a little bit. I teach a course at UMA in state and local politics and in the spring, and I'm always talking to the students when we start talking about tax policy about how it's different from state to state. And that many states tend to focus more on sales tax because, sales tax is more discretionary, it's more progressive, as we say.
You have a choice.
Than property tax, you have some choices. You can also count on people from out of state paying a fairly significant piece. In Maine, about 30% what comes in
Right.
sales tax is paid by tourists or summer residents or what have you. Maine relies way too much on the property tax, particularly for a poor state. In 2010, and Ralph the Wizard ran these numbers for me this morning. In 2010, between the state income tax, personal and corporate, the state sales tax, and all property taxes collected in all 500 municipalities, the total amount of money taken in was about $4.4 billion.
Okay.
Okay? $2 billion of that was property taxes, and the $2.4 billion was sales and income taxes. So that means that of that total pie that either pays for state services and or local services, 46% was property tax, 20% was sales tax, and about 34% was income tax.
Oh.
Once this budget goes into place, as proposed, it gets even worse.
Yeah, yeah.
48% of all of those revenues come from the property tax, about 20% from the sales tax, and about 31% from income tax.
Yep.
It ought to be reversed.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and I mean, if I was the wizard with the wand, clearly,
Right,
I would be
right.
exporting some of my tax burden to the tourists, and I don't think it would keep them from coming here.
Nope, I
Right.
think
The
you're right.
classic
Right.
example that you hear is when any of us decides to take 2 weeks in Florida, do we even look at the
Right.
what the sales tax rates are for the rooms, the meals, the stuff we buy,
Right,
and so
right.
forth. So I think, and again, I don't want to suggest that the only solution is taxes.
Right.
Because I'm not that way. I've never been that way. I'm unfortunately got a reputation in Augusta
this
for
budget does
cutting
raise
jobs, but yeah, and you know,
We're raising taxes whether
clearly,
we-
It just raises
Clearly.
the property tax, not the state tax.
unless you really don't care about core services like police protection and fire protection and public works and
Snow plowing
and education. If if those are secondary to you, then sure, we'll cut. But if those have a high priority for you, then as Clinton said during the Democratic convention, the math don't work. And
Yeah, yeah.
something else has to happen.
Gary,
And
do
I
you-
just to piggyback that, I do think what's really interesting here is this idea that somehow by cutting at the state level, we're solving our budget problem.
Right.
Well, we're not. We're just pushing it off to some other form of tax. And I think Bill's point is an excellent one. When we think about how we pay for all these services and make these investments that are so important to having vibrant communities and better quality of life, it's this mix and how they work together. And to enact a budget that actually puts more on the property taxes after many citizens less than 10 years ago said, enough.
Right.
We rely on property tax way too much. We need to rebalance this picture. Is fascinating.
Let me interrupt.
Go ahead. Yeah.
My city council, from time to time, has to sit in closed session, in confidential session, with individual property taxpayers who cannot meet their property tax bill. And there's a thing called poverty tax abatement. And if an individual comes in, typically it's an older person, not always, comes in, has suffered some sort of massive catastrophe in their life, lived in the same home for generations maybe.
Right, right.
The property's about to go for unpaid taxes. We've heard more gut-wrenching, heart-rending stories like that. You cannot sit through a few of those a year for 15 years and not believe that there ought to be less emphasis on property tax for government revenues in Maine and more emphasis on other sources.
Right. Well, if you fail to pay your income tax, you get fines and penalties and interest. If you fail to pay your property tax, you lose your home. I mean, the stakes are humongous.
And I just, Jody, on this sort of how this all translates to sort of
Yeah, thank you.
the person at home in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, what's interesting is I did this with my in-laws this past weekend because we were talking about the governor's budget and what it meant to them. And I said, well, you know, part of how you figure out what it means to you is just look at your property tax bill.
Right.
Because on most people's property tax bills, and at least the 4 or 5 from different municipalities I've seen,
it's required by law.
I think it's
All of them,
required that
yep.
says without state aid to education and state revenue sharing, your tax bill would have been X% higher. Now I happen to have the one from Newcastle, and without those things, the tax bill would have been 29% higher.
Yeah.
You know, we received some information from folks in Presque Isle, and they're showing that if this budget goes through as proposed, the average property tax increase for folks in Presque Isle will be about $550 a year.
Wow.
Now that well exceeds the average Mainer under the LePage administration's income tax cut will be receiving about $120 in benefit. So on one hand, $120 in income tax cut, but $560 in property tax increase. And that doesn't include people who might have, for instance, been using the circuit breaker or programs like that. So this, from our standpoint, this is a terrible budget because not only does it not make the kinds of investments we need to make to get ourselves in a better position coming out of this recession,
Right.
but it ultimately completely undermines and erodes not only our ability to pay for these things going forward, but also the fairness of our tax system.
Exactly.
Going into this budget cycle, on average, the bottom 20% of Maine households pay about 17 cents on the dollar in taxes, state and local taxes.
Both combined, yep.
The top 1% of households pay less than 10 cents on the dollar. And if this goes through, that's going to get even more skewed.
Yep. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, okay, we know we have this budget hole. We don't like the proposal that's on the table. What else might the legislature consider to balance the budget?
Well,
And either one. I know you both have ideas.
well, I think Bill's alluded to the sales and lodging is certainly one area. You know, exporting taxes in a way is something that's been talked about in the past. You know, doing things that get back to a fairer tax system, like I just referred to. So there are ways you can tweak the income tax. I mean, the most obvious solution on the table is if the estate tax cuts cost us $50 million in the coming 2 years and only benefit 500 of the wealthiest households in the state, I think we could put those aside for a while until our revenues recover. The income tax cuts cost us about $340 million over the 2-year period. Again, you know, look at what Angus King is saying at the federal level. He's saying it's okay to have these tax cuts or to tax increases in place, but let's tie them to some trigger, some recovery mechanism in our economy. When Maine was in a similar situation a couple of years, well, in the 90s, what did we do? We did a surcharge on the income tax, so we raised income taxes for folks, and we did a temporary increase on the sales tax.
You know, people want to say that municipalities could become more efficient. They could collaborate more with other municipalities. And I'm sure there's an opportunity for that, and I wouldn't take that off the table.
Right.
Continue to challenge municipalities and school departments to be more efficient. Happy to meet that challenge. Not to this degree, thank you. But, you know, I would suggest to our legislators that, you know, that, and I think they're mostly committed to restoring at least some of the revenue sharing. Well, carve out a piece of that and put it in an incentive program to reward municipalities for real collaboration. Not the soft stuff that goes.
I'm going to have to let that be the
real
last
stuff.
word, Bill, because
Oh,
we
come
are
on,
out of
Jody.
time. I'm sorry. You've been listening to State of the State. I'm Jody Harris with the Maine Center for Economic Policy. Thank you for tuning in today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.